Thanksgiving, and we sure are glad to have you. I know you couldn't be with us on Monday. John will be covering the Carolina basketball game tonight as they try to get a win against Virginia Tech. They need one, but we'll come back to that here in just a little bit. Your thoughts on Carolina and where they landed last night in the CFP rankings at 15?
I mean, about where I thought they would. I mean, not where I think they should be. You know, I thought they should be a couple of spots higher. I feel like they should be in that 12 range. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is what it doesn't surprise me that that's where they were, considering what the committee has done so far. I think South Carolina needed to make a big move this week and just didn't do it to have like a really good shot at the playoffs, even with a win. But you know, win this weekend and see what happens. But you know, you still have to win this game first.
Yeah, it's good having Clemson in the top 12. I wish they were higher. The thing with all of this is, all right, so you talk about head to head, right? Mike hit on this earlier. He mentioned, I had it in my notes too. It's just an excellent point. Like in college basketball, you talk about good wins, bad losses, or good losses, if there is such a thing, quality losses, quality wins, all those type of things. You don't hear any of that. You have the head-to-head situation, guys, with Ole Miss, Carolina, and Alabama. Gamecocks lost to both of them. Their poorest performance of the year, of course, was against the Rebels on their home field. But then you look at some of the teams that they share opponents with. You know, Ole Miss also lost to LSU down in Baton Rouge. You could say Carolina's worst loss is LSU, but we also know the circumstances that surround the game. But their worst performance was against Ole Miss. You look at Alabama, they got beat by Vanderbilt. South Carolina beat the crap out of Vanderbilt on their home field. Alabama was embarrassed Saturday night against Oklahoma. South Carolina ended that game up there in the first 4 minutes when they played in Norman. None of these questions are being brought up to the committee. I know they don't have a lot of TV time, but I'm not so sure that they would have the answers if you did bring them up and ask them what the separator and the reasoning is. And the only thing they'd be able to point to is head-to-head.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a little bit of a contrarian stance, a little bit, and I'm sure it's going to bring some comments from the Carolina folks. But I don't know that you can get that deep down far into this, right? Like, you know, we're talking about so many different things already and can't come to a consensus on what the most or on what the best criteria are. If you start looking at 2 and 3 steps away on who beats who and who wins, and just if you go that far in this, I mean, are you going to go to, you know, where they won the game, how much they won that game by, how much they lost that game by? I get where you're coming from, and I understand, but you know, we're looking at it from a strictly South Carolina standpoint. I mean, you start doing these dives into all of these teams and all of their arguments, and you know, it just becomes a maze that you can't get out of. So,
hey John, can I be contrarian to your contrarian for 1 second on that? Okay. If Notre Dame loses to Southern Cal Saturday, they're out, even though they would only be their second loss. Why is that? Because they don't love Notre Dame? No, they desperately want Notre Dame in this thing. We know that. It's because the Northern Illinois loss was so bad that almost counts as 2. Now, I realize there's no such thing as a conference loss in the SEC that's as bad as Northern Illinois, but my point is that they do look at bad losses. That's not like completely foreign, but I think what they've done is they've just said, well, it's the SEC. No such thing as they're all the same. Every loss is about the same. It's really not. I mean, losing to Kentucky is not the same as losing on the road in Tuscaloosa, right? So I don't think it's too much to at least look at that in terms of which team has the most bad losses or the worst losses versus which team really doesn't have a bad loss in terms of quality of competition. That's just
yeah. Well, no, and I'm not talking about these one-step deals. I'm talking about how, well, if you look at Vandy's loss compared to Vandy's loss to Alabama compared to, you know, South Carolina's win versus Vandy, like you're talking two different times of the season. You're going a little bit too far when I think you start comparing some of those things. No, I mean, I agree with you with your Notre Dame stance and NIU and that step of it. I'm just saying that you can go too far down the road in trying to compare some things, because at some point, like, it just becomes too much with too many different teams, and you're too deep into the weeds.
I tell everybody that gambles, and any gambler will tell you this: never compare scores. Never sit there and assume, well, they beat this team by this, therefore, ergo, this thing. I mean, that's a rule of football. We know that. We talk about it on the show. These guys compare scores, John, because this is how, and I follow the logic, but it's lazy, in my opinion, and it's not optimal toward getting the best teams. And they sat there all offseason and said, it's not about the most deserving, it's about the best teams. No, it's about you're on the deserving train, right? And I looked at the makeup of the committee, and I'll get to that at some point during the show, but and it doesn't surprise me. But here's how it all played out. So we got 3 SEC teams at 9-3. Okay. All right. South Carolina's 0-2 against the field, so they're third. That doesn't matter. They're not looking at anything else. They don't give a crap about. It's going to be hard for me not to cuss today. They don't give a crap about anything else. Ole Miss, get Bama, are 2-0. So now it's between Bama and Ole Miss. And so how did they arrive at Bama and Ole Miss? Well, they both have some bad losses, et cetera. Bama's were on the road. But what they did was they went to that LSU game. Ole Miss lost by 3 in Baton Rouge. Bama won by 29. Ergo, Alabama. Everybody wants to know why Alabama, after losing by 3 touchdowns, is ahead of Ole Miss. That's why. Because they don't play. And then they just move on. What kills me is Ward Manuel's defense of Indiana. As Craig pointed out in the chat box, he said, well, they actually played pretty well. We were impressed with them against Ohio State. What are you watching, bro? What are you watching, brother? And then he starts bringing up, and I know he's the athletic director of Michigan and a huge Big Ten homer, and that's obvious. And then he says, Indiana actually played a good schedule. They've beaten Washington and Michigan and Nebraska. Let that sink in for a minute.
Yeah.
Here's a team that's a great story, and I have tons of respect for them. They're basically James Madison from last year with a little bit of extra talent added in. 16 transfers from James Madison. Really good football team. Would not be 11-1 without their schedule, though, at all. Not even close. Right? And we're going to use Washington and Michigan and Nebraska, 3 big-name programs, but 3 500 football teams this year in that conference, which is not even close to the SEC. I don't care, except for with money. And we're going to use that as a reason to prop them up, right? But with these SEC teams, you got 3 losses, therefore you're not bad. And what pisses me off even worse is the media talking about 2 ACC teams getting in. I went through SMU's schedule. You may as well if you're an SEC team, you may as well change conferences if it's going to be like this. There is nothing impressive about them except for winning against the competition that they're matched up against. They were a group of 5 program last year who's done a good job getting a roster together to compete in the worst conference in college football.
Well, that's what it is. Yeah,
I think the Big 12 is better, top to bottom. You match up a Kansas State with a Syracuse. I think K-State wins by a couple of touchdowns, right? So this notion that Miami, who, if it weren't for a very judgmental call from the league office, the shady people that run the ACC that can't ever make any good decisions, that have driven the conference into the ground, I can go on and on. That gave them a gift, because there's nothing about that touchdown Virginia Tech scored that would lead you to overturn that play from every angle. There's not enough evidence. It was the wrong call to begin with, but that's life. But no, we can't have Miami go down. Clemson's already lost. Oh, my God. Judgment call. And then escaped the mighty Cal Bears in Strawberry Canyon by the skin of their teeth. Could have gone down to Duke. And this guy's sitting there talking about Booger McFarland was sitting there talking about how impressive they were, that they looked like that same team that beat Florida because they pulled away from Wake Forest in the second half. Meanwhile, Ole Miss gets dinged all to hell for going to the swamp against a good Florida team that's on a roll and losing by a touchdown. I mean, I'm just beside myself. It's not necessarily how they decided between the three in the SEC. That's going to work itself out. And again, I'll point to this. Texas is third in the country. Nobody wants to talk about Texas's best win is Colorado State in the opener? Does nobody wants to talk about that? I mean, it's pretty logical to look and see, hey, the highest ranked team in the SEC this year is, the team that avoided every good team but one and lost and got their ass cut on their home field by them. I mean, what lot? I mean, because they're Texas? I don't know. I don't want to think there's bias. But it's like there's totally different standards for everybody. And it's all funneled into, hey, we're going to show the SEC. And I don't know if that's their opinion. I think they'll be able to explain anything away, like you said, John. I mean, they could get too far into the weeds, and we'd get just a pile of dung at the end of an explanation. Nobody can do anything about it. But I mean, it may not be what they say. It may not be in their heart. It may be subconscious. But this is not why we expanded the playoff. We expanded the playoff for good teams in tough conferences to get a chance, right? We didn't expand it for an 11-1 dog shit SMU team to get into the finals because they were the runner-up or 11-2 because they were the runner-up in the ACC. That was not in politics. We talk about the founding fathers and their intent. This was not the intent of Greg Sankey and Petiti and the people that matter in this sport agreeing to this format. I rest my case.
You can talk now, John.
I'm sorry, John. I need to get it out now, man, because it's Thanksgiving, you know?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're right about
hold
that.
this over into into tomorrow.
And I'm mad. Yeah. I'm more mad because of the process that South Carolina, hey, play better. You don't lose by that bad to Ole Miss. Maybe it's closer. Maybe there's a bigger gripe right now. But I think the SEC deserves 5 teams in. They won't. But people are sitting there talking about them only getting 3. I mean, nobody realizes just because your conference does not have a dominant team, that's not what a strong conference is.
Mm-hmm. I don't think there is a dominant team in college football, period.
No.
That's not just the SEC. I don't think there's not a runaway freight train team this year in college football.
I'll be very honest. I think Ohio State has
that other day.
I think Ohio State is the best roster, but they don't show up half the time, you know, and they may be bored, which remind me to make a point about Clemson later on that end of things. I think Oregon's nice. You know, I have now look, Gamecock perspective, don't be upset Clemson's 12th. If they weren't playing each other, yeah, that's crazy. But you know, it'll help Carolina the higher they are.
I'll just say one other thing. Go ahead. I'll get to it.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Well, it's still kind of relevant to what we're discussing. And I touched on this, but I couldn't remember the specifics last time. To go back to the 3-headed monster that is Carolina, Ole Miss, Alabama, I'm not going to let that go. I'm sorry. Yeah, there it is. Thank you, Phil. Bam.
Going to the scoreboard
again. Ole Miss. Like, I was there for that game. Ole Miss knew they just played their way out of a playoff. It was right there on a table. The rest of their resume is not great. I get it. They beat Carolina and Columbia. That matters, but you have to consider the strength of schedule, the strength of record, and some of the bad losses. The Kentucky loss is just that stands alone. That Carolina and Alabama don't have that. But here's the other thing on the head-to-head argument. Going back to the BCS, let me take you through that nightmare for just a second. In 2000, Miami, a very loaded Miami team led by Butch Davis, played the Florida State Seminoles on October the 7th and won 27-24 in the Orange Bowl. Okay? Miami finished the season 11-1. Florida State finished the season 11-1. Miami had the head-to-head. Guess who played in the BCS national championship game between the two, or of the two? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was Florida State with a Thornton Mellon at quarterback, the oldest quarterback in college football, Chris Winkie, who I think was 106, and he led his team to a title over Mike Vick and Virginia Tech. So there is precedent. Head-to-head, even with two teams with the same number of losses, hasn't always been the end-all, get-all when a committee is involved. They've looked at other numbers and other metrics and said, well, no, wait a minute now. I get it, head-to-head, but that's not the only thing. It's obviously important. It's incredibly important, but when you're really picking that dung out of pepper because there's so many things that these teams have in common, metrically speaking, sometimes you have to think a little bit beyond that. So the committee has done that in the past. I realize it's a different committee, it's a different setup, but back then we still did have voters and computers that selected the teams. And in that head-to-head scenario, both teams won-loss. They took Florida State over Miami, despite Miami winning head-to-head.
I think it's an excellent point. And John, when you to kind of shift this into the game this weekend between Clemson and South Carolina, this playoff right now is providing an incredible opportunity for this rivalry and for the South Carolina football program, in my opinion, because we grew up in this state. We understand it. Mike, you were the voice of Carolina. I mean, you worked there for a long time. We all get how incredible the Clemson Carolina rivalry is in football, really in all the sports, but obviously in football. But the one thing that has been missing for years, in my opinion, is Carolina's fault. They have not had enough success to elevate this rivalry where, like the Auburn, Alabamas of the world, the Florida States, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have a trophy case. Clemson does. So that's on the Gamecocks. But now that you got this college football playoff, for the first time in the history of this rivalry, these two teams are playing for something more than just bragging rights and feelings. I mean, if one of them or whoever loses this weekend either is not getting into the CFP or has a major hurdle to get into it. And so I think the future of this whole thing, John, really could get a boost if these programs will continue to play well, playing this game at the end of the season on Thanksgiving weekend with the playoffs on the line, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This sucker can start to get a little bit more national attention.
Yeah, I agree with you. And to go back to my initial point to start all this, I think South Carolina should be ranked higher right now than both Alabama and Ole Miss. So, I'm not trying to say that South Carolina should be behind those folks. I think they should be ahead based on the fact that South Carolina's got better quality wins. I mean, and we're assuming South Carolina wins this weekend, obviously, and all of this. Yeah. So, and they're playing better right now. Like that to me is a big deal. I mean, those are the two reasons why I think South Carolina should be ahead. I do think you can go too far down the path, but I think South Carolina should already be ahead. Anyway, back to your point just now. Yeah, I mean, when you start talking about how you have 12 teams going into this playoff with an opportunity to compete for a championship, then going into the last weekend, you're probably going to have 20 teams who figure that they've got at least some type of chance to make it in there. And, that's a lot of teams playing for something meaningful there at the end of the season. And, South Carolina wants to be a top 25 program at least year in and year out. Clemson has been here recently. South Carolina was for a brief point in time. And, it's as you said, it's South Carolina's fault that this rivalry hasn't gotten more national play here lately. But, I think that there is a lot going in favor of the Gamecocks from as far as trending forward and becoming and building a sustainable program. So, I like where South Carolina currently stands, and Clemson doesn't look like they're going too far away from the playoffs anytime soon. They're not certainly the dominant program that they were for a little while, or in that upper echelon there that they were for 6, 7, 8 years. but they're not showing any signs of being out of playoff contention. So, this is certainly a hopefully first game of a lot of meaningful ones in a row for both programs.
That's exactly right. Actually, if you look at the slate this weekend, I'd love to get everybody's thoughts on this. I think we're all anticipating that Texas and Texas A&M has a chance to be a really good football game on Saturday night. Probably should be, because there's a lot on the line for both of those teams as well. But when you look at the rest of the slate, and I know that some of these rivalries being played this weekend, some of the teams in those games are having down years. I don't know that on paper that there is a better football game than this one that's going to be played right here in the Palmetto State. You look everywhere. Look, some of these spreads this weekend, guys. 19, 26. This is a rivalry weekend, right? And then here's the Carolina-Clemson game being played, and the Tigers right now are favored at 2.5. It might end up being the best game of the whole weekend, and it'll be the first one that kicks off on Saturday.
Dabo even mentioned it yesterday in his press conference. He said, this is the one that everybody's going to be talking about. This is the best one.
But it's the most meaningful because you could make the argument it's the most meaningful. I think to piggyback on JC's point about Texas, I mean, if they lose, let's just say by double digits to A&M, you could make a strong argument that Texas doesn't belong in the playoff and that one of those 3-loss SEC teams should leapfrog them. I don't think the committee has the stones to do it, but
right.
I do think if you just looked at pure resume at that point, you could say Texas is not, they don't belong in. And whereas for Carolina, Clemson has to have it or they're out. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Carolina has to have it to stay in contention. And it's one of the rare. Pete Iacobelli did a good piece for AP talking about the history of these teams playing as ranked teams. It hadn't happened since 2013.
But Carolina's 5-1 in those games.
That's the other key number that he mentioned.
The point. There's only 6 of them.
Yeah, which is almost impossible to believe. But the fact that who would have guessed Carolina was that dominant in those matchups? And the only loss, and I was there and I saw it, I had a really good view of that play, is a push-off by Gardner. You might have seen that in my title there if you're watching on YouTube. Gardner pushed off, he did. But yeah, so Carolina's actually, when Carolina's got a squad, they play really well in this game. But unfortunately, as you talked about, Jamie, in the history of time, more often than not, Clemson's just had a more talented, better team, and then that's why it's a lopsided in terms of overall wins and losses.
Well, I think that's indicative of the whole series. Isn't that, John? How much have you dug into this over the course of your career? Generally, the better football team wins. There's not a lot of upsets in this series.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big point spread guy, so I haven't dived into that. But you're exactly right. I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, emotions can only take you so far. Like, they're usually the better of the two teams wins. Now, there are a lot of games, not all, but there are a lot of games that are usually really competitive, and probably beat the spread, cover the spread one way or the other. There's certainly some that have been real duds, and I've been to a few of those too. So yeah, but I'm with you. I'm with you. Talent usually wins out at the end of the day, and I think South Carolina's got a little bit of an advantage in most of those spots there going into this game. But we'll see how all of that ends up playing out.
Yeah, since 2000, South Carolina's beaten Clemson 8 times. 6 of those wins have been over ranked Clemson teams. So they've beaten when Carolina, the last one in 13 was Clemson was 6th.
Yeah.
Well, it was a double-digit
ACC championship teams too, right? Yeah, that's the fun part about it. Yeah.
Yeah, Clemson was a 14.5-point favorite 2 years ago. Carolina wasn't ranked. Clemson was in the top 10. So it was one of the rare upsets in the series.
That would have to be one of the biggest of all time for Carolina over Clemson. 14.5-point dog and a win.
Yeah,
I actually think it was.
I would think so.
You're right. It's like the best team usually wins, but also the team playing the best. Like last year, both teams came in pretty having won, but Clemson was just a little bit more impressive. Notre Dame, North Carolina, they were scoring in the 30s. Gamecocks beat Jacksonville State and struggled. Vandy, who was done by then, cooked, and then a big emotional win against Kentucky, set by 3 points. Clemson was probably playing better, and it's still a good game. Other than, I mean, Clemson's defense was just dominant. But in 2022, South Carolina, I think, was playing better than Clemson at that point, but based on the win over Tennessee. But you're right. I mean, it's not like Alabama and Auburn, where if that game were in Jordan Hare this weekend, I would almost tell you to a man Alabama's in trouble. But that one's a little bit more unpredictable. I think this one you can feel good if you're playing better ball right now.
John, before we got to hit a break here, just a couple of minutes, but final thoughts on the game, something you'll be paying attention to early, and give us your synopsis on what's going on right now with Carolina hoops. They desperately need to beat Virginia Tech tonight at 6 o'clock on Fox Sports 1. Yeah, and I mean, I just think if South Carolina plays as it has been on the defensive side, and the defensive line is able to do what it's done all year against Clemson's kind of banged up but getting healthier offensive line. I think South Carolina should probably win this game. I noticed somebody pointed out today on the Big Spur message boards, and I thought it was very interesting that some guys at Pro Football Focus had a podcast where they pointed out that, Clemson's faced 4 pretty good, solid defensive lines this year. Louisville lost, Georgia lost, Pittsburgh almost lost, and one other, and that was a really tight ball game. So, if Clemson's going up against a good defensive line, which they will be this weekend, it hadn't been easy for them. So, I think that's kind of the biggest key, and I think that's where South Carolina can probably win this game is up front. But, from a basketball standpoint, I mean, tonight's game to me, I think is a big deal. Lamont Paris kind of brushed aside the notion that nothing about tonight, but what they've done up to this point was disqualifying in any kind of nature or concern for any nature or for what's to come down the road. Said, it's basketball. You have the opportunity to figure out yourselves early, and once you do, you start playing better basketball, and you'll be where you want to be in the end. So, in talking about I'm assuming from an NCAA tournament standpoint. So, I do think that today is a big deal. You've got to start winning some games against good competition. And, I saw Boston College had a last-second win yesterday to move to 6-1. That's next up after this one. So, they've still got some opportunities out there against good teams. Clemson's not too far down the road. They're top 30 in the Ken Palm ranking. So, but you got to win a couple. You don't have to win all of them. I know there's some folks out there who are saying, well, the NCAA tournament's gone. I mean, you've lost 2 games away from home against top 25 teams, and plus a bad loss. Nothing has been disqualifying in nature up to this point. But at some point, you got to start to build a resume instead of having just black marks on there. So I think tonight is a big deal.
John, what has Lamont said most recently about Cam Scott?
We haven't asked about him in detail lately. And to be honest, that was something I was going to ask him about after today's game, just because I wanted to see a little bit more sample size on him, right? Like his minutes increased a little bit this past game. It felt like I don't have the numbers to back that up on me
18.
right now. But yeah, I thought he played with a little bit. I thought he played better defensively against Xavier the other night than he had been. I thought he was on the floor when South Carolina kind of got things going a little bit on the defensive end. I thought he's played better, and maybe that's why his minutes were as good. He has not hit the 3 ball well. He didn't come in as a dead eye sharpshooter, but he's a guy you expect to not knock down shots at a greater rate than he has from distance. And, we saw, a glimpse of, what he could do on making the move from top of the key for the dunk. And then, he had the little slash through the lane and kind of one-handed jumper that was erased because of the shot clock violation. Hopefully you start to see a little bit more of that, but that was, that's one guy who I wanted to find out a little bit more about from Lamont soon. But after there was a little bit of a sample size, I didn't want to be the guy asking about Cam Scott after every game. It's kind of like Nick Harbor early in the season when Shane was finally just like, he's just a wide receiver, guys. Like, I'm tired of hearing about it. So, but I think there's a point now that there's enough games there where it's like, okay, well, how do you assess where Cam Scott is? And, I think I thought he made a little bit of a jump from last week and into this game against Xavier, and maybe he can add to that tonight against Virginia Tech.
Carolina comes in 80th in the Ken Palm ratings. Virginia Tech is 127. John, thank you so much for all of your time. Always, we surely are better when you're on each week. Safe travels back home. Enjoy the ball game tonight. Hopefully they give you something good to write about. Most importantly, I don't know what your plans are for Thanksgiving, but hopefully it's enjoyable. Happy Thanksgiving, my man.
I will be in the Pathfinder for most of my Thanksgiving, but we will be celebrating on Friday with the family. So I will certainly have my fill of turkey and all the goodies and sides as well. Just 24 hours later than everybody else. So appreciate you guys having me. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you.